Welcome back to the Kelowna Real Estate Podcast. I'm your mortgage broker host, Taylor Atkinson.
And I'm your real estate agent host, Matt Glenn. What's happening, Taylor?
Well, I got out and voted this week.
Yeah, you early voted. I'm not. I'm going day of.
You're waiting until,
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're recording this on the 24th of April.
Yeah.
And voting's 28th? Like, are we going to know the results that night?
I think we'll know the results, or at least have an idea.
We thought the same thing in the provincial election, and
Yeah,
it took like another 5 days.
That's true. Yeah, so when we listen to this, everyone might be scratching their heads still, but I think we'll know an answer. Yeah.
I actually think the provincial election it seemed like a more technology advanced voting system. This one, like I got there, I didn't know if I was coloring in the circle, putting an X, a check mark.
Really?
I was trying to read instruction. I asked the lady, she's like, oh yeah, no, just the check mark. I'm like, so someone manually has to go through and read all these? It just seems like such a crazy system, but
That's crazy. Man.
Yeah.
If you're confused, that means that like 50% of the population's confused, dude. Like, holy shit.
I feel like there should be a better system that removes the human error, like a digital system that just
if you have a digital system, isn't it hackable? Don't they like the human error?
Yeah. Okay.
At least then you can get a recount. Like, I don't know what the best thing to do is, but clearer instructions, obviously.
Yeah. As we're sitting right now, like as of today, and who knows, like really what the polls mean. I don't know how they really come up with this stuff, but
yeah, nobody ever asked me.
Yeah. Do you know how the polls work?
I don't.
So right now, Liberals, they're at 42% and Conservatives are at 38%. But I think it's trending slightly. Liberals are coming down slightly and Conservatives are coming up. So it's going to be like split.
Yeah. Pierre was way ahead and then Trump got in and's been pissing off Canadians. So then Carney came way back and was ahead. And now they're kind of evening out, I think. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. It's interesting. For me personally, I feel like I'm in an echo chamber because, I see things one way.
Well,
and then
in the real estate industry,
people.
I think we are in an echo chamber for sure.
Yeah.
One thing I got to say is I like that we have like a 35-day election. Like, man, I would not want to be dealing with this for 18 months. I like that. It's just like, get your point across and get people out.
That's actually like a good positive spin because on the final question of the debate, when they asked them, what do you like about this election? And they were like, I wish I could have gone out. And they all said the same response. I wish I could have met more people and I wish the election was longer. And I was kind of like, yeah, I guess they haven't really had like a fair chance, but really.
Goddamn politicians. Go out and meet people when there's not an election.
Yeah.
Have a town hall, for Christ's sake, if you're so worried about that.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, I feel like we've been talking about an election for like a year now. Like it's been inevitable,
Yeah, honestly. It's nice that it's not in everyone's life forever. So like it's kind of just here we go. And we just live with the consequences next week.
Yeah. Well, exciting times. We'll see. Yeah. Well, on this show, we had an awesome guest, Mark Goodman. He has the Goodman Report. He's based out of the Lower Mainland, based out of Vancouver. He's been in commercial real estate, I think mostly multifamily for the last 20 years. And, his dad was an agent prior to him. Really cool origin story. Like his dad basically did a mailing list, making envelopes, door knocking, personally handing them out. And Mark's evolved it to where it is now, where it's a annually, project, and then does monthly mailouts as well and stuff like that. So really good resource. Has his own podcast, puts out cool LinkedIn stuff. So we wanted to speak to somebody that sees the industry down there because, we're hearing a lot from like Vancouver and Toronto of like the trends of certain asset classes. So yeah, he was a great resource to talk to.
And he is very stoked on the possibility of a Canadian 1031 exchange. So that's kind of interesting to hear.
I mean, just seems like a no-brainer. So if anyone doesn't know what the 1031 exchange is in the States, basically it allows you to defer capital gains if you reinvest it, into the economy. So you sell a property or potentially a business, there's capital gains. As long as you reinvest that back in, it's great for the Canadian economy. It's great for that business or investor.
It gets things moving. When you sell these properties, you don't have massive tax bills. You just buy another property and things move. I haven't honestly read up a lot on like why we wouldn't want this besides less government revenue, I guess. But it just seems like a positive to me.
Yeah, but I think the government revenue will be there at some point, right? When you do stop deferring those at some transaction. But like if the economy is doing better and GDP is growing, the government's going to be making more money. So it's more of a long-term plan, right? But
honestly, I hope that one goes through. And the GST on homes, just cut that too. Let's get some homes moving here.
Yeah, there's been some great promises over the last month. Yeah. So we'll see who holds up their end of the bargain here. Probably
Absolutely.
Nobody.
Yeah. Here you go. The election's over. Here's the hose. Everyone get down.
Yeah. We're not cynical.
But this is a great episode. Mark is a lot of fun to talk to. Obviously, you can tell he podcasts himself because he's on it.
Yeah.
This episode, like every episode, is sponsored by Century 21 Assurance Realty. We got our fingers in all the pies around the province. We're there. We're a great brokerage to work with. Kind of like a cooperative environment. Obviously, when you're a real estate agent, you're your own person, you're your own business, but we have added a cooperative spin to it, and it's worked out well for our agents. So if you're an agent looking for a new brokerage or to change things up, give us a call. Or if you're a buyer or seller looking for an agent, call one of our stellar agents up or just call me. Enjoy the show.
Okay, welcome to the Kelowna Real Estate Podcast. Mark Goodman, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you guys?
Great.
Well, we like to start our show just so our listener can get to know you a little bit. What's your perfect Friday look like?
The perfect Friday. That's a great question. Showing up to work with a subject removal, with a bank draft for a deal that's gone firm day Friday, and perhaps a closing as well. That would be a great Friday, coupled with perhaps a nice non-stressful lunch, walking distance from my office, and then maybe a massage during lunch if I can carve out some time. That would be good. And then heading home and, just relaxing and maybe a little socializing that evening, I think would be great.
I think you nailed it, Mark. Honestly, that sounds like a great Friday.
Let me know when you have one of those. Yeah.
It's been a while. Normally it's just grueling, intense whack-a-mole, solving problems all day and then wolfing down lunch in 10 minutes and dealing with difficult people.
Yeah, our listener can't see, but you've got a map of Vancouver on the background there.
Yeah.
Where is your office?
We are located in Vancouver in the South Granville neighborhood. So we're on 10th and Granville.
Nice.
It's really the center of the city. And we're, 5 minutes away from downtown Vancouver, just over the bridge. We have perfect access to the west side of Vancouver, east side of Vancouver, over to Richmond. So we're very central.
That is a nice location. That's actually a stellar location. Yeah.
I've followed a lot of your posts on LinkedIn and Goodman Report that you put out, and you've just finished, your kind of final Goodman Report for the year, I guess.
Yeah.
I would love to focus on that because Vancouver is such a good indicator for kind of the rest of the province, really, with trends. So can you break down kind of common trends, any changes over the last 12 months, good or bad?
Sure.
And just kind of give us the insight.
Well, now that you've asked, I happen to have hot off the press our year-end report 2024, which is packed full of stats and commentary and themes for 2024, and many of which are carrying over to 2025. So I'm going to read some of the highlights just because I can't remember them all. There's been a lot.
That is a comprehensive book. How many pages is that report?
You're right, it is. It's 20 pages.
Wow.
Nice.
Full of stats, and anybody can download it online, goodmanreport.com. We put out 2 a year. The mid-year report and the year-end are big seminal reports, and in between we publish a lot of articles. The hard copy mail out goes out twice a year.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it started in 1983. And when I joined the business in 2002, we took it online. So we have quite a large following. So the themes, 2024, I characterized with a few bullet points. Inflation finally under control, but interest rates went up and then they went down and then they went up. So it's been that kind of roller coaster. Capital gains last year, that looming deadline, and everybody freaked out. I think it was June or July. I can't remember.
June. Yeah.
It was insane for us. We had 5 deals close within a week of the deadline, $90 million. Some of our clients, in theory, would have saved, $1 million just by making sure they didn't get captured by that increase in the inclusionary rate to, I think it was 66.7% instead of 50.
Yeah.
So, and now, as you know, both Polyev and Carney have suggested they'll do away with the capital gains tax, which I think is a great idea.
Capital gains increase.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we could get rid of the entire tax, that would be good too.
Yeah.
Residential Tenancy Act changes. There were more changes to the act, which further eroded property rights in British Columbia. Big theme, astronomical development cost charges, also known as DCCs, were approved for 2025. That's been a real problem, particularly in this environment where we have still very high construction costs, soft costs, long entitlement periods. So that really was the death knell for the development land industry, which continues today. Another theme, court-ordered sales, receiverships continue to grow. Big news last year. It continues this year. We just signed up our third court-ordered sale. Our client is Deloitte, and we are going to be marketing a condo site in Burnaby that is under receivership. Some of the other themes, new land use policies in flux. So we have TOA, transit-oriented area development policies. So there was a deadline that was imposed in 2024 by the province to mandate that all the municipalities within BC comply with their new rules, which is essentially doing away with restrictions or having a minimum height and a minimum density around transit nodes to build. And it basically is the province understanding clearly that the cities aren't building fast enough, they're not building high enough, they're not building enough, and trying to relieve some of the pressure because we have a housing affordability problem. That caused a lot of confusion because not all municipalities complied with the deadline, and also the devil's in the details. So for example, the province came in and said, you have to have a minimum height and a minimum density, and there's certain tiers of density depending on how close you are to a transit station. So they could mandate that, but the city controls the minutia, like what are the frontage requirements? Is there inclusionary zoning, below market zoning? Is there a pace of change? They may restrict how many developments could go through per year. Are there a maximum amount of towers per block, which we have seen in the Broadway plan? So Vancouver did okay because Vancouver was able to replicate and really mirror the work that they did for the Broadway plan and use that program for the TOA, transit-oriented area policies. But other cities haven't really been able to comply or have everything flushed out so there's clarity. So that's still causing a lot of confusion today when a developer wants to look at a piece of land. They still don't have clarity on how they could go about realizing redevelopment.
Are there some cities that are like standing out worse to deal with in your area?
Yeah, until recently, Burnaby was real tough.
Okay.
Basically said they didn't want to deal with it. So it's always changing in flux, but yeah, that's been a challenge.
Yeah, okay.
So what we have in Vancouver for most developments now is 20% has to be below market or affordable rental. In a lot of cases, unless you're in the highest density area, which typically is around 6.5 FSR or 20 stories, even then it's hard to pencil out because that 20% below market is a drag on the pro forma, and the rents have to be 20% below market or at the same rents that the tenants were paying before they moved out, whichever is lower. The tenants have the right of return to come back at the same rent. But you don't know how many tenants are going to come back after 2 or 3 years of going through the development process. So there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of risk. The other notable factor in 2024 that has continued into 2025 is softening rental rates. It's been really significant. Like, I can't remember the last time that we've had such a pronounced change in rental rates, particularly in the higher rent areas or where rents were pushed pretty high. And so that's causing a lot of havoc in the market because in addition to high construction costs and long entitlement times and all the risk and uncertainty which comes along with being a developer, now you have to rejig your pro formas because, some developers were banking on $6 plus per square foot in rents. And that has really come off. So many opine that it's because there's more supply in the market. Perhaps that's one factor. I think it's more to do with just a really tough economy and people losing their jobs. And, fatigue has really set in the market. Like, not everybody can afford these crazy rents. So there's been a pronounced adjustment there. And I would say now going into 2025, the most interesting or exciting thing that we've heard from our politicians is the idea that we may have rollover, which would allow investors who sell investment properties to reinvest their money and not have to pay capital gains tax, which, we refer to as the 1031 exchange in Canada. So that would be really interesting. And I think for anybody in the transactional based business, whether you're a mortgage broker, a realtor, or otherwise, I think we would see a lot more liquidity and velocity in the market. I think we'd have to hire another couple brokers just to keep up. That would be a good problem.
Can we just talk about the benefits of that program? So yeah, as the listener knows, this has been going on in the States first century, 1031
Yeah.
exchange. You sell, you can defer your gains essentially as long as you reinvest into real estate, which is just a fantastic idea in Canada, because if we want more supply and this allows movements of property, it can be a second house as well, like a vacation cabin, something that you're going to pay gains on. You can roll that over into something else. So is this going to be kind of the next catalyst to actually put some more units on the market?
It would be huge.
Yeah.
There are so many scenarios. I read an article, I don't know if it was in Business in Vancouver, where they have a case study of a business owner that owns an industrial site somewhere in the Fraser Valley. They want to sell the property because they want to expand their business. But if they sell the property, they're going to get hit with a massive capital gains, and the cost benefit, doesn't work out to sell the property. Yet they're struggling because they need to expand their business. At the same token, that land, the highest and best use is actually rental development. And so if they sold their property to a developer, now we would have much needed rental housing built. So win-win for everybody, win-win for the community, win-win for the renters, more supply, win-win for this business owner that they can go on and expand their business and hire more people. Yet the government's got their hand out. It doesn't make sense. So you basically frozen the market. That's just one example. But I think to have a healthy, balanced market, we can't penalize people for continually risking their capital and trying to make a profit. And if you keep taxing people to oblivion, we're going to lose the entrepreneurial spirit here in British Columbia and Canada, and people are going to take risks and move their money elsewhere.
What's funny is I just dealt with this in my own business, where I had a land assembly where there was 4 houses for sale.
Yeah.
And then the 5th one, the corner one, which was kind of like the money property to the whole thing, was a rental property. So the 4 owners, all owner occupied, wanted to live there. And then the rental property on the corner, I approached them and said, do you want to sell, so that we can build an apartment block? And they said no, because if I sell, I'm going to get killed on capital gains.
That's right.
So they just didn't sell. So the corner one's still there. The other 4 sells, and now they're building 16 townhomes when it would have been 72 unit.
That's right.
Building, all because of the one person. And she's right. She would have effectively not made any money because of that. Yeah. It makes more sense for her to just keep the property as a duplex rental with 2 units there. It's a funny thing.
And it's not always on the big scale too, right? A lot of people think this legislation comes down and it's going to just support developers. But even if somebody has a small condo that they've been renting out for years and years and years, they're better off just to refi it and defer those gains and keep it as a rental. But what if a first-time home buyer wants to buy an affordable condo? Well, if they, remove this capital gain or do a rollover, that allows somebody to buy that as a home, a owner-occupied home. So yeah, huge opportunity with this.
What's the argument against this? Because when I look at it, it's just positives across the board. Why would they not do this? I couldn't think of a real reason.
The government is used to extracting their pound of flesh, and our whole system in Canadian government is based on a very onerous tax ethos. And things are changing now, because now we realize that we have to compete and we have to attract capital and we have to bring back investors. And I think foreign investment would be very healthy for the economy. And Trump's putting on the pressure. And maybe he's doing us a favor in the long term, that we can't be reliant on the United States and that we have to grow up and look at alternatives and create a more healthy, balanced economy. Because if we don't, we're in serious trouble.
Yeah. And the beauty of this program is, if you're reallocating that capital back into Canada, that's
right.
The key point. Because right now there are people, selling assets and going elsewhere, like the States or Mexico or wherever you want to go.
Do you know how many BC developers have pens down? They're done with Vancouver. They're moving to Calgary. If that's not a sign of the times, I don't know what is. But yeah. They don't want to have anything to do with taking risks here. And just to build anything here takes years. In Calgary, you can get something done in a year, go through the entitlement process and make some money and provide housing.
Yeah. I'm sure this is a lot in your report as well. It's the uncertainty that we've had over the last couple of years is killing transactions and killing opportunity. And this is a great program, but to summarize it over it's just about a year now, capital gains inclusion announcement came out. It was supposed to be implemented in June, then maybe delayed, then it's going to happen, it's not going to happen. And now we're talking about wiping it out altogether. Larger transactions take a long time. So if somebody put pen to paper, you could crystallize those gains previous, like you could, reassign that asset in a different corp and pay those gains, which was just essentially a money grab from the government. Yeah. But then it didn't happen. And then you still have that transaction that's going to play out to sell. What if you sell before, this program doesn't get, like, it's wild how much money is left on the table here. Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, kind of to stay on topic with your report, where are we headed in 2025? What are the trends looking like? And can we talk about, everything, like what are cap rates in Vancouver? How many transactions have been happening? Vacancy, where are we going with everything?
Well, I'll start with like the notable trends in 2024 and how I think it's going to play out 2025. So 2024 finally was a recovery year, sort of, when compared to the previous 2 years. So we've had 2 consecutive years, 2022 and 2023, saw declines in transactions and dollar volume in the Metro Vancouver multifamily market. And in 2024, we bounced back. We had an increase in transactions of 33%. So we had 97 sales throughout Metro Vancouver compared to 73 transactions. So that's significant. But dollar volume was major. There was a major change. We went up 71% from the previous year. So 2024 saw $1.78 billion in total volume compared to just $1 billion a year earlier. So we've had a 33% change in transactions, but a monumental change in dollar volume. And that's because we had a few major transactions. We had 3 deals over 100 million, which is really big for our city. And so major pension funds and institutions came in and bought some newer product in Vancouver. So that really inflated the dollar volume. I would say some other noteworthy trends in terms of buyer profile. For years, it's been very consistent. Generally speaking, 10% of all the transactions in Metro Vancouver were by pension funds and REITs, generally. Most of them out of Toronto, some out of Alberta. But for the most part, our market's been, about 85% private investors, mom and pop, anything from a 10-suite apartment building right up to a $50, $60 million deal. About 85% were private and high net worth individuals. The other 10% institutions, and 5%, give or take, were nonprofit or government entities. And that has changed significantly, where government and nonprofit represented 19% of all the transactions last year. And that's due in part to a provincial initiative called the Rental Protection Fund, where they've allocated $500 million to nonprofits in ways of grants and subsidies for them to buy this older rental housing that we see today throughout Metro Vancouver. I've been critical of the program. They're not creating any new rental housing. They're really just shifting the building from one ownership group to another. And if you're one of the lucky few that it's part of a nonprofit, you'll get your rent subsidized or frozen in time. But it's not really adding supply to the market. But in any event, I think it was very politically expedient for our premier and province to roll out this program. If anything, one could argue that it causes more scarcity and more demand because you've literally removed affordable housing out of the public sphere for regular people into the nonprofit sphere. I don't think it's a very elegant and efficient way of helping affordable housing or creating affordable housing. It's kind of a blunt tool where you buy a building and the tenant lucks out. A lot of these tenants didn't need to be saved. Many of them make a decent income and they just happen to be living in that building that was purchased by a nonprofit. And, they'll stay there for years. So in any event, that I think really contributed to the dollar volume and the transactions in 2024. Institutional groups, pension funds and REITs dropped a little bit. They represented 7% of the transactions, and private individuals represented about 74%. So there was a change there. In terms of value, if we look at Metro Vancouver across the board, so that includes the city itself, neighborhoods like Kitsilano, Fairview, Marpole, the west end of Vancouver, and then, of course, the suburbs, Burnaby, North Van, Coquitlam, you name it. The price per unit was flat. So in 2024, the average price per unit was $462,000. and the previous year was 459,000. So there was a 1% increase across the board in price per unit, but it's not the best way to look at value because there's different pockets and nuances to different areas. And many of the properties, apartment buildings that were acquired were for redevelopment. And so in many cases, developers paid a lot more for the land, and that really pushed up the price per unit. So the devil's in the details. In Vancouver, there was a 17% increase in average price per unit. So we were at 570,000 a unit versus 486 the previous year. Again, there's some, sales where the sites were purchased by developers that pushed the price per unit to over $1 million per unit. So, but it just gives you a general sense of where the market, I do not see any pronounced change in value over the next while. I just think things have stabilized. Interest rates have come down. The one trend that I think is going to be very noteworthy is the amount of listings on the market. For the last 3 years, what I've heard from investors or people considering selling is, we're just going to wait. Anytime there's uncertainty, push the pause button. We're going to wait. We're going to wait for the market to get better. We're going to wait. When interest rates go down, prices are going to go up. And what I try to communicate to people is that interest rates are only one variable that dictate market value. It is not the Hail Mary indicator of how values are going to manifest based on interest rates. What happened was people waited. They waited 3 years. Interest rates finally came down about 100 basis points. I mean, you would know better than me. And what happened was there's 4 times as much product on the market. So, at Marpole, there's a dozen listings hanging in the market for, between $320 and $380 a door. Nothing's been selling. It's been like that for a year. I came up with a few listings at $300,000 a door. There was crickets. We just sold one building for $260 a door.
Wow.
And we made the market. And that kind of screwed things up for everybody else. This is supply and demand. The market doesn't lie. We just tied up another building around $260 a door. Well, 3 years ago, they were selling close to $400 a door. So, there's been about a 25 to 30% drop per unit in Vancouver properties. We're seeing less of a pronounced drop in newer purpose-built buildings or properties that had a higher yield. So it's a much more sensitive time today for cap rates. Your going in cap rate is very important. Gone are the days where a buyer is going to feel comfortable putting down 70% and having a 30% loan to value, which, by the way, I've done some of those deals, at a 2.5 cap. But, before 2019, cap rates were less important. They were temporary because entrepreneurs, people would go in and they'd rehabilitate these old inefficient buildings. They would give notice, rehab the building, and double the rents, also known as rent evictions. That game is over. And so, you could be stuck with a building and just wait for natural attrition, natural turnover, and then, you would go ahead and update the unit. So cap rates are much more important today than they've ever been. The lending environment is different. Everything takes longer. They scrutinize the numbers more. Less flexibility. We're still doing deals, but I would say that the cap rates that we're seeing are generally in the very high 3% to low 4 cap rate range. Of course, there's nuances for every deal, but generally we're in the high 3s to low 4s. We just closed on a building in Mount Pleasant, a really nice old 1960s building. It sold at a 3.2 cap, which is lower than we typically see. However, the price per unit was $330,000 when, generally speaking, the market, in that area was trading around $350 to $370. So in return for a lower price per unit, the buyer accepted a lower yield. But over time, 2 or 3 turnovers, you're going to get those rents up 50 to 75%. That cap rate will change very quickly. So it's not all about cap rate, but I would say it's much more important today than it's ever been.
That does seem a bit higher than I thought it would be in Vancouver. Do you feel it's going to keep going up?
I think things have plateaued right now. I think 5-year money, CMHC insured, you're probably around 3.5, 3.6. It's quite volatile. It's changing all the time. Mm-hmm. So, you're going to need something close to that in order for it to make sense. I don't think cap rates are going to drop or increase. I think things are going to be stable right now.
Yeah.
And we finally have data points. Until recently, we had appraisers calling us all the time, like, how do you value a property when the last trade in this neighborhood was 8 months ago, and that's ancient history? The way we were pricing properties is we look at what was currently hanging on the market, which was a lot, and then you got to undercut the price. And finally, we started getting some sales and data points. So, I'd say we're in a much healthier environment. It's more balanced now, but it's not a seller's market anymore, which traditionally what Vancouver real estate used to be.
Yeah.
Buyers have a lot more choice and options right now, and they're much more careful.
You raised a good point there. I think historically we've always looked at real estate and said, yeah, there's a value add with the, rent evictions what was that, 2022, I guess, something like that. They changed it.
I think before 2019, the legislation was such that it allowed you to evict tenants for the purpose of renovation.
Yeah. So, now you nailed it. You're like transitory. You have a renter move out, just by attrition, and you can increase rent. But, something you said a few minutes ago, which we've seen in the Okanagan as well, rents have been decreasing. So are those units that are on the market, are they still so undervalued that even if that tenant moves out, there will be a rental increase?
Yeah, for sure. Like we had a client, this is a bad news story and it's not typical, but it would be on the extreme range of bad investment decision or bad timing. We had a client come in who purchased a building in the West End in 2017, which was really it was peak. Interest rates were low, prices were escalating very quickly. And they bought this building at a very low cap rate at the time. I figure it was around a 2% cap rate. And I've sold a ton of these properties at 2%. They didn't start the renovation program right away. And half the building had rents at $600 to $700 a month. A one bedroom today, you could be around $2,500, right? So they had these units rented for $600, $700, about half the building. And then they spent $1.5 million renovating the building, not the suites, but the common areas, the exterior, the roof, the windows, which doesn't increase your rent.
Yeah.
Then they had holding costs and their mortgage just matured. So it went up, quite significantly. So they're in a negative cash flow situation right now and they're bleeding. And, what do? It's been professionally managed. I looked at the rent roll, and even in the last 2 years, the property's been rented out at $2.30 a square foot when it should be around $3.50 or more. So their manager has been doing them a disservice as well over the last 2 years. So it's really a bad luck situation. So they're into it for about $15.5 million, all in. Renovation costs, holding costs, brokerage fees, and so forth. They're into it for about $15.5 million. Well, the property is worth probably around $385,000 a unit, which is in the higher 3 cap range. And, it pencils out to about $8 million. So we're talking about a $7.5 million loss.
Jeez.
Since 2017. And, a lot of investors think, well, we're only seeing that craziness in the land market. We are having these massive swings downwards. Well, it's happening in some cases in the multifamily market as well. The perfect storm. Your mortgage matures, your interest rates tripled, you're softening rents, you're not getting the turnover that you thought. This is not an easy game. You have to manage the manager and you're running a business. And so unfortunately, there's a few people getting stuck right now.
Do you have the stats for what you guys are using for expense ratios right now? Because I imagine that's increased substantially.
We don't use expense ratios. I find it a flawed system. I don't think it's a very elegant way to look at expenses and compare apples to apples. And I'll tell you why. When I started in the business in 2002 or 2003, expense ratios were more common. And they were about 33%, pretty consistently. The market was stagnant. It was flat. One bedroom units were $750 a month. Price per unit in the West Side was $80,000 a door, and cap rates were 6%. That was, for about a year when I started. And what happened was rents just started increasing exponentially. And so your expense ratios logically dropped. Expenses didn't increase at the same rate. And then we had this renaissance of new purpose-built buildings where now you weren't being stuck with legacy tenants, you were renting at market. And market is not the CMHC average. That's a snapshot of rents frozen in time. Market was like way higher. And so expense ratios started dropping to about 16, 17% on new builds because the rents were quite high. Or you can have an underperforming building where the rents are really low. And so your expense ratio is going to be over 50%. So what we use is price per unit. Price per unit is a much better way of looking at buildings. And I would say like for an older building, 50, 60-year-old building, you're going to range anywhere from $5,500 to $6,500 a unit right now. And maybe a little higher for newer purpose-built buildings. It depends, if there's underground parking and an elevator and, the type of staff you have managing the property. But we rarely look at expense ratios.
How many clients are you seeing high level that are using MLI Select compared to just, conventional financing?
I would say my gut right now is about probably 70% are going for CMHC insured money.
Wow.
It's a much better interest rate and longer amortization periods, and it tends to work. However, for buildings that are underperforming significantly, buyers are not going through CMHC. They're getting conventional loan and they're trying to add value, turn over the building. In some cases, our clients will offer money to tenants to move out. So the soft approach. So it's a win-win for the tenant, win-win for the landlord. And then when they get their rent roll, it starts looking better, they'll go through the CMHC process. So that's what we're seeing. I've noticed that the timelines for getting CMHC insured financing right now are quite long, a little longer. We don't like to have buildings under contract for more than 30 days. We try to keep it under 30 days, which is really not enough time to get, the rubber stamp from CMHC. Basically, we're seeing a lot of bridge loans right now where mortgage brokers are assisting our clients with conventional financing. They'll close with a CMHC approved lender and then they'll roll it into CMHC a few months later. So there's an additional cost to it, but it seems to be the route that buyers are going today so that we're not stuck waiting for 6 months under contract.
That's interesting. I mean, we're seeing a lot of purpose-built rentals in Kelowna as well. We did an episode recently. We have about 5,000 units coming on the market over the next few years. And, it's about a 3% add to our current inventory. And I believe most of those would be MLI Select as well.
Yeah.
It's a great program, but is it kind of holding up that side of the industry right now? Like artificially, if things aren't penciling at these cap rates, it works. But I guess if we were to compare MLI Select compared to the rollover, the 1031 exchange, what would you prefer if you had to pick one? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Rollover all day long.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, look, CMHC is in vogue right now. It wasn't always in vogue, but they've got some decent programs and it makes sense. But, if they're not around anymore, there'll be another mortgage product that will fill the market quite quickly.
Yeah. I do want to ask one more question before we kind of wrap up here. I know we got to be cautious of time, but how did the Goodman Report start?
That's a great question. It started with my father back in 1982. Before that, he was a residential realtor for 10 years at a national company called NRS Block Brothers. It was the big company in Canada, and he was doing residential sales. I was just a kid. He became the number one realtor in all of Canada. He won an award, and he was working a lot. Back then, there was no cell phones, there was no pager, there was no email, there was no internet. How the hell did you do a deal? It was couriers and rotary phones.
That's crazy. That reminds me of that meme. It's like, what did people do before Google Maps? It's like, they use maps. Maps.
Yeah, I don't even know how to use a map now. Yeah. So, back then they were doing deals with carbon paper contracts on the hood of a car, and you were sending couriers for documents. There was no fax. There was nothing.
And the MLS was literally a book.
It was a book.
Yeah.
So, that was 10 years. He would smoke a cigar in his office. He had 20 typist secretaries, and it was a different time.
Yeah.
And after that, he wanted his weekends back. He wanted something a little bit more cerebral. He started doing business with the mogul Nelson Scalabania. He sold a few buildings to him. Many of your audience may not know who he is, but he was the most prominent flipper real estate cowboy in the history of the world. Google Nelson Scalabania. He was amazing. Sold Wayne Gretzky to the Oilers, but he was buying and selling. He was doing about 600 transactions a year on a napkin. You couldn't keep track of his deals, making $20 million a week on flips. In any event, that propelled him to move more into commercial real estate. He decided that there was a vacuum of information in the apartment market. Nobody had information, so he decided to start the apartment building newsletter, which got rebranded to the Goodman Report. And as a kid, it was truly a family business. So he would write the newsletter on a pad of paper, send it to someone to type up. It would go to a printing press, and then the whole family would get around the dining room table, and we would have to stuff the envelopes. So you can imagine I was, how old was I in 1982? Well, I was about 5 years old. We were stuffing envelopes, folding them, licking stamps, and my father would write a note to every owner, handwritten. And there's about 2,300 apartment owners, so you can imagine it took a long time. But, we had my grandparents come over, the cleaning lady came in, my brother, we were folding, and before you knew it, he was the number one guy in the apartment business. And that continued for many years. I started back in 2002, joined the business, and the rest is history. My father retired 6 years ago, but we took it online. And I said, Dad, we should really have a website. And he goes, what do I need a website for? Everybody knows who I am. I'm like, you should also get a computer on your desk. He goes, what do I need a computer? I got my secretary to do the faxes. But when we started gathering emails, I remember our first email blast. Like right now we have, 150,000 followers through our email distribution list and on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. But back then, I said, we're going to take the Goodman Report online and we should get emails. I remember getting 1,000 emails through calling owners, mailing them, asking for their email. They would say, what's an email? And I'd like, well, you can get one on AOL, if you remember those days. And I would walk them through to subscribe. So I did that for a few years. And I remember I got 1,000 emails and now I had to send them. And there was no bulk email programs back then. It was old school. But you couldn't send out 1,000 emails through Shaw or TELUS, whatever we use, the ISP, because they thought you were a spammer. So I had to go meet with the IT person at Shaw and ask them to whitelist our ISP for 24 hours so I could send out 1,000 emails, which, by the way, was huge. Yeah. So our first listing, sending out by email, 23 years ago, was a building in Chilliwack. And I didn't even know where the hell Chilliwack was. I just remember it was a really long drive. And my father said, we don't typically do stuff in Chilliwack. It's too long of a drive, but, it's a nice building. And my dad wasn't very enthusiastic, but we took a picture. I wrote a description. The IT department was on standby. They whitelisted our IP. And I sent out 1,000 emails for this Chilliwack listing. And the phone blew up. It rang off the hook. We got multiple offers. And, my father had been in the business for 25, 26 years, came running down the hall and he goes, this is fucking incredible. I've never seen anything like this before. This email thing is amazing. This internet is amazing. This is a good idea. This is the future. And the rest is history.
That is awesome. Well, I mean, huge takeaway there is there's a massive amount of work ethic in your blood. So I appreciate that.
We have fun every day.
That's great.
Good. Yeah. I hope this was fun. It was good for us. And I really appreciate you coming on. Keep the report coming. And appreciate all the information you're providing to us.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you guys and be on your show. I go to Kelowna once a year. It's a beautiful place. Time slows down. It's hot. It's beautiful. I love the Lake Country. And I'll come visit you guys the next time I'm up there.
Sounds great.
For your audience and listeners, if you're interested, you can subscribe to goodmanreport.com online. We send you news, views, listings. And I also have a podcast, the Goodman Report Podcast. So we've had a few people on, and you can listen to that on all your favorite platforms. So thank you guys.
That sounds great.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.